What is your best ghost paranormal experience story? Story 1. When I was a kid, my favorite uncle was the youngest in the family. He was my hero. He had just finished high school and I was like 10 or 11. We would go and visit on spring break and over the course of the summer, and I always looked forward to seeing the guy. We'd listen to records and tapes, and he introduced me to bands like The Cult and Inks, The Doors, Bowie, Stevie Ray Vaughan. As I entered my teenage years, my life started, and my friends became the center of my universe, and those spring break and summer visits eventually stopped happening. Eventually, I graduated high school, and around the same time, my uncle started a family. A few years out of high school, and my mom called me up and let me know my uncle had passed away. I hadn't seen him in a few years, and when I asked what happened, the only reply I could get was he was sick. It wasn't until years later I found out he had taken his own life. He didn't leave a note or anything, but the general consensus was he learned he didn't have long to live and took the easy way out. Here's where things get interesting for me. Shortly after the funeral, I start having dreams. I'm a pretty lucid dreamer, not in the sense that I can decide what I want to happen in a dream, but I can recall my dreams in vivid detail. Maybe there's another word for that. I don't know. Anyways, I started having dreams about my uncle. Sometimes we were just sitting in his room from when I was a kid, listening to music and making jokes. Over time, they became very strange. One dream I had, we were in a movie theater sitting really close to the screen and we were eating popcorn. The screen was playing something, but I couldn't distinguish what it was, and my uncle was talking, but I could not figure out what he was trying to say. Another was the two of us in a hallway and all the doors were locked. The most troubling dream I had about the guy, which was also the most recurring, is when I would find him sitting at a rope bridge. He would stare at this bridge and get up and try to walk across it, but there are snakes that would strike at him when he tried to cross. A snake would snip at him and he'd go back to where he was sitting and just look at me, then look at the bridge. So I'd walk on to this bridge and look across, and every few feet is a very angry snake. All the way across, I grabbed my uncle's hand and took him out on the bridge, and he would be apprehensive because of the snakes, so I stood in front of him and kinda hopped up and down on the bridge. The momentum, or whatever you call it, from me bouncing on this rickety old bridge made the snakes angry, but if you bounced enough on it, the snakes would eventually teeter over the side. It was a very strange eureka kind of dream. So, my uncle would step out onto the bridge walk a few feet, bounce the bridge so the snakes would fall off. The dream would always end with my uncle making it across the bridge and me getting this feeling of reluctance to follow him across. Then I would wake up with this overwhelming feeling of sadness. These dreams happened for almost 20 years, always the same. Me and my uncle shooting the chute, or me helping him solve a puzzle of some sort. The snake and rope bridge was the most common. Never told a soul in my family about what my uncle and I were up to. I always thought it would be upsetting, like he wasn't at rest, like he was in purgatory or something. Maybe he was. I eventually just came to accept that my uncle was haunting me, and for the most part, I didn't mind. My grandmother died a few years ago. Nothing tragic. She caught pneumonia and never really recovered from it. One night, she went to sleep and never woke up. We celebrated her life, hugged and healed the way families do when passing comes to visit. Since my grandmother's funeral, I haven't had a single dream about my uncle. Not one. I think that was the confirmation I needed that there's something out there for us after we die. Or maybe my grandmother passing away was the catharsis I needed to let my uncle go. I look back on it now, and I like to think that my uncle was just lost. He was lost in life, and that carried on in passing. I also think my grandmother, on her way to the sweet hereafter, found her baby boy, picked him up, dusted him off, and brought him home. Answer: this was really nice to read. I'm sorry to hear about your uncle. I don't know what I think about the afterlife, but I'm sure there is a connection in dreams. My friend passed away, and I remember dreaming for what felt like all night about us talking. I can't remember what we talked about, but it felt beautiful, and I felt peace when I woke up. I've read a lot of similar stories on here. Story 2. This is my brother's story, but it's a good one. He was working as a night porter at an old hotel from the 18th century in the northern English countryside. One night, a woman came down to reception as white as a sheet, with her suitcase, saying she could not sleep and did not want to stay there. My brother inquired as to why. She said she could hear children laughing all night, and a child had entered her room with a candle and was standing at the foot of the bed and wouldn't leave. My brother mentioned it to his manager the following morning, and he was told that it is a regular occurrence. Before the hotel was a hotel, it used to be used as a school and kindergarten over 100 years ago. Story 3. Not a ghost story or paranormal, but a true experience. Many years ago, I was working in a shop, and an old lady had purchased several bags of shopping. It was a little icy outside, and I knew the lady lived less than 100 yards away from the shop, so I offered to take her shopping home for her. She was shocked that I would offer, and ever so grateful. On the way to her house, she kept saying thank you to me. I told her it was no problem, and I was happy to help. She said she wished more people like me were helpful, etc., etc. As we reached her door, she opened it and stepped away so I could enter. I told her that I was okay holding the bags and she should go in the house and get out the cold. She thanked me again and stepped in the doorway and took a few steps down the hall. I walked in behind her and put the shopping bags on the floor. I asked her if she wanted me to help her put things away, and she insisted I had done enough, and thanked me again and again. I stepped outside and turned round to say bye to her. As she was closing the door, she said, "Thank you, young man. I will watch over your soul from heaven." A few days later, she was found dead in her home, in the hallway next to a few bags of slowly rotting shopping. Story 4. Me reading these stories while my cat looks at me from down my darkened hallway, her eyes reflecting the light. LOL. I've had a bunch, but one that stands out was probably the time my then youngest son had gotten me up crying about a bad dream he was having at 3 a.m. He was 4 at the time. I calmed him down, then he told me he's hungry, so we go to the kitchen for a snack. He's sitting there eating cereal when he just kind of looks up and then casually tells me the boy who woke him up is sitting in the corner crying, and he nods to an empty corner of the room by the table where we're seated. I asked him why the kid is crying, just kind of humoring him when he tells me his mommy crashed the car up the road, and now he's trying to figure out what's going on. He woke me up. Please tell him to go. So me thinking it's my kid still shook from the bad dream, look at the corner and say, "Hey, kid, go back to your mom." We keep sitting there and my son finishes his cereal and hands me the bowl. Just kind of joking around, I ask him if it worked, and the kid left. And he looks at me really seriously and say, "Yes, he told me the ambulance is coming, so it's okay. They're all dead anyways." And not even a minute later, a string of cop cars and an ambulance go past our house, sirens blazing. And I got this feeling of the most intense dread while the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I shook it off, told myself it was just a kid's imagination and coincidence. We went back to bed. A few days later, my neighbor tells me all about the big wreck a mile up the street from us, where some lady was going too fast and flipped the car coming around a curve and no one survived. At 3 in the morning, on the night my kid had woken me up, I didn't dare ask her if a little boy was in the car. Story 5. Schizophrenic family member went on a bit of an alcoholic bender, pre-diagnosis, and ended up in the hospital. Her husband, who was a bit older, passed away suddenly while she was in a coma. When she awoke, first thing she said to my mom was, "I know husband's name is gone. He came to tell me. Very freaky." Story 6. My brother's bedroom was next door to mine growing up. One afternoon, he asked me what I was doing the previous night that made me laugh so much. Confused, I pressed him for details. "About 3 a.m. last night, your laughter woke me up. It sounded like you were pacing your room too, pacing and laughing." At this point, I told him that I wasn't home last night. I'd been at a friend's house. He went pale. To this day, he swears blind that it was my laugh. I have a very distinct laugh, apparently. Answer. So creepy, my sister had a similar story. Our second-floor main washroom had a door to the hallway and another that connects to my bedroom. One night, she was washing her face and said she distinctly heard me laugh out loud. She opened the door to ask me what was so funny, only to find an empty room. She was creeped out, but thought I may have walked out to the hallway. She texted me once she was back in her bedroom to ask where I went. I've been at a boyfriend's house that entire weekend. I was never home. This story still freaks me out to this day. Story 7. Camping at a friend's family property with a group of friends. They had a huge, dingy shop full of old tools and old furniture that was super creepy. Dirt floor, clown paintings in the loft. Not even kidding. We stayed up late drinking by the fire, and I was the last one awake. Went to go pee on the side of the shop and stood about 5 feet away, looking inside through the window. There was a fluorescent light on, and I noticed what looked like a piece of paper or dollar kind of floating around. I thought it was a moth at first, but it was moving in a very flowing figure 8 pattern that was very, rhythmic. It reminded me of dangling a carrot. I watched it for maybe 20 seconds, which felt like forever. Then it quickly floated back to the corner of the shop where it was dark. There was also a wood chair near the corner that added to the creepiness. Could have been a moth, though. I sat back down by the fire to finish my beer and have a smoke. No one else was awake, so I played Robot Unicorn Attack 2 on my phone for a while. I noticed my friend Mark pop out of his tent to pee, then go back in to go to sleep. I decided sleep sounded good, so I went to my tent and fell asleep. The next morning, we were having breakfast, and Mark said, "I saw you guys sitting by the fire super late. How late did you stay up?" I told him I was probably 2 or 3 a.m. Then he said, "Who was up with you?" I told him I was the last man standing. He said, "I got up to pee and saw you on your phone and 2 people over, your shoulder watching you play." He said one person looked bigger, so he thought it was one of our friends who was a bigger dude. He said the other person was taller and skinny, but none of us are noticeably tall or skinny. Freaked me out. We still camp at that property once a year. But I don't go in the shop, and I go to sleep whenever my wife decides she's tired. Story 8. The house I grew up in was haunted. The way it was laid out, I could see from my bedroom down the hall and into the living room. My parents' bedroom door was on the other side of the living room, directly across from my door. Late at night, I would hear someone pacing circles in the living room, but I was the only one awake in the house, and we didn't have pets. I never said anything because I didn't want the family to think I was nuts. Eventually, I moved out and went to college. After I graduated, I was in a rough spot financially. My parents had bought a new house. The old one was still empty. They were considering getting renters and offered it to me to stay in for a while. I said no, I didn't want to move in. Mom asked why. I finally gave in and told her I thought there was a ghost. My mom froze and turned to look at me and was like, "You hear her too?" Turns out she had also heard it for years and didn't say anything for the same reason. Answer: my grandma and her family had a similar shared but not mentioned experience. Grandma fled with the kids from an abusive husband and for a time stayed in a really old, drafty place. It was pretty grim, but they had nowhere else and were at least safe while they looked for a way out into something better. My oldest uncle used to see a middle-aged woman standing in the doorway of the bedroom, watching him and his siblings. It would also stand over him at the foot of his bed, just watching. She was dressed in pale, old-fashioned clothes. It really unnerved him. He said it felt menacing, and as though it didn't want him there. But he didn't say anything to anyone because he didn't want to alarm the others, and they had no option but to be there. It wasn't until years later he mentioned the place at a family reunion, and my grandma said she disliked the place and couldn't wait to get out because she was sure she used to see the ghost of a woman in pale clothes watching her. Creepy AF. Story 9. I had just started a new job. The building I worked in was really old, definitely pre-war. I had to stay a bit later than I normally would to get something done, and by the time I was packing up to leave, my floor was pretty empty. I needed to use the restroom before I left, so I walked over there. And as I approached the door, I saw someone else open the door and go in. I remember vividly that they were wearing a pink shirt and khakis because that's what I was wearing too. I was also mildly annoyed because I don't like being in the bathroom when someone else is in there. After deciding I still definitely needed to pee before the commute home, I entered the bathroom. But when I got in, it was completely empty. I don't know how to describe the energy in the room, but it was very tense, completely silent. I remember being able to hear my heartbeat. After standing completely frozen for what felt like 10 minutes, it was probably like 15 seconds, I turned right around and left. I had nightmares about that bathroom for weeks. It seems so simple and uninteresting compared to a lot of other people's stories here, but it really shook me. There was something definitely off about the whole thing. Glad I work from home now. Story 10. This isn't my story directly, more my mother's story. When she was 7 or 8 months pregnant with me, she would accompany my biological father to the local stage theater where he acted in various productions for rehearsals. One job she had taken on her own, even months or years before she became pregnant, was to sit in various places in the house and take notes. She would sit in a few seats on different sides of main level, including on the left side, right side, center, the row right behind the orchestra pit, and even in the very back row. She would go up into the balcony and sit in a few seats up there and in some of the box seats on either side of the theater. She sat in these areas, noting how the sets looked and how the actors looked on their marks from her angle. She would note if the orchestra sounded too loud, you couldn't hear the actors singing, for musicals like The Music Man or Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, or were too quiet. She would pass these notes on to the director, producer, and other people who would need them. The set designer would get notes like tree blocking view of Charlie Brown on stage left. The orchestra conductor would have gotten a note like clarinets. Too loud for wedding march, sunrise, sunset, from Fiddler on the Roof. One particular night, as rehearsal was starting to wrap up, my mom, being muy ancienne with me, got up from her seat. As her feet were now hidden by her belly, it was difficult to see where she was walking, even more so since the lights in the house hadn't come up yet. Heading down a flight of stairs, she took a misstep and almost fell over, when she felt somebody take a strong, firm grip on her upper arm and pulled her back. She felt that same grip suddenly pull her forward, but very gently, and it never released until she got to the landing near the exit. She turned to thank the person who helped her down, but there was nobody there. Answer: I went to the Grand Canyon in 3rd grade. Fan around like any kid while hiking. My parents constantly were telling me to stay away from edges, to stay on the path, stay close, etc. Long story short, I was 1 footstep away from falling over some very high cliff. Like slow motion, could see my foot going down and not meeting any ground. Right before my foot went too far, I felt someone pull my shirt of my right shoulder and pull me forcibly back towards the path. I immediately thought it was my dad. After the few seconds of shock, I turned around expecting to see my dad very angry about what almost just happened. Instead, there was no one there. My parents were in front of me, almost 50 feet ahead. Story 11. Not sure if it was a ghost or something like that, but back in 2015, when I was younger, I was at my cousin's place. We were hanging out in her grandpa's backyard. As we are messing around, we hear screaming and banging coming from the living room window of the house. We look up and see a woman crying hysterically and hitting the windows. We shout and ask her if she's okay, but she tells us to leave her alone and shuts the window completely. Her grandpa and grandma weren't at home at the time that happened. The strangest thing was, when we went into the house, the woman was gone, and we just brushed it off. Story 12. I've got a few from my grandparents' ranch. The original house was built in the early 1800s, and the graveyard from the original family is still there. When my family first bought the property, the previous owners were still living there for a few weeks until they moved. My grandpa was out riding around and saw a guy from a distance dressed in slacks and a white shirt suspenders. My grandpa assumed it was the previous owner, so he drove up to say hi. As he got closer, the guy walked behind a bush and seemingly disappeared into thin air. He told the previous owner about it, and he asked, was he wearing a white shirt and suspenders? Apparently, they've seen him a lot wandering around in the evening, almost always where my grandpa saw him too. A few months later, when I first visited, me and my cousin were playing PS2 in the living room around midnight. There is a huge sliding glass door facing the backyard barn. I noticed 2 people walking around outside with what looks like rifles and Civil War caps. It looked like they were marching almost. Eventually, they kept going into the darkness while me and my cousin were shoot ourselves in silence. Nothing really happened for the next few years besides. Footsteps and weird feelings. I would hear super loud footsteps at night and assume it's someone walking into the kitchen. I got creeped out, so if someone else was awake, I would take that opportunity to go get food. When I realized no one else was awake, I ran back into my room, LMO. Fast forward to when I lived there during college, I had my own little cabin down the road, and it was really creepy, but cool. One night, I had a friend over, and we were up pretty late. We heard some footsteps on the gravel outside, and then louder footsteps on the front porch. Then I saw a silhouette of someone through the window walking around. I jumped up to go make sure it wasn't some meth head, but when I walked out front, there was nobody there. And it's an open area, so there would be no place for anyone to run or hide. Safe to say we didn't get any sleep that night. That's about all the super creepy stories I have, but plenty of your typical paranormal things have happened over the years. This was on the Devil's Backbone in Texas, BTW. If you know the stories of that area, you know it's a creepy jerk place. TLDR, my family's ranch is either haunted or Civil War. LARPers keep fudge with us. Story 13. In 2012, my grandmother suffered a major stroke resulting in hospice in her home, with her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren by her side. Friends and family were able to come by freely and spend time with her. I was very close to my grandma and was lucky to be able to share much of this time with her. For anyone that has ever been through hospice with a loved one, you will understand how hard this type of thing can be. One night I was sitting at home in my office catching up on some work when all of a sudden the room filled with the scent of perfume. I'm not talking about a faint smell, I'm saying it was very distinctive and strong throughout the entire room. I stopped everything I was doing and said out loud to myself, "Something is wrong. That is Graham." I had not spoken to my family that day, but felt an urgent need to send a text message to my uncle, whom was staying with her, to ask, "You guys okay?" This was at 11:20 p.m. I got a response right away saying, "Might want to come say goodbye." Not okay. I quickly rushed over. Upon arrival, the living room